My title is Look Back in Hunger, Ireland in Famine's Wake, from Munster to the Maze, or from the Faerie Queene to Steve McQueen. I hope I'm addressing the topic of consumer culture. This actually started from a lecture I had, which is mainly about Swift's modest proposal, but I looked at a little bit about the way in which Spencer spoke of hunger in relation to cannibalism and starvation in his view of the present state of Ireland. So I hope I'm addressing the topic of consumer culture, if only obliquely and without infringing the Advertising Standards Authority. In this paper I propose immodestly to take a trip through 6 centuries, over 400 years, of writing about hunger in Ireland. From the Faerie Queene to the Famine Queen, to Steve McQueen, so I've got all my queens in a row, like little pups. In an essay published 20 years ago, actually its origins lie in a lecture debate that I attended in the spring of 1988. Brendan Bradshaw examined 16th century English atrocities in Ireland in order to argue that the Cromwellian massacres of the 17th century were not aberrations, but were rather part of a pattern of violence which was central to the historical experience of the inhabitants of the island in the early modern period. Bradshaw detected in recent revisionist historiography a failure to engage with what he called, quote, the phenomenon of catastrophic violence as a central aspect of the history of the conquest. He accused revisionists of cerebralising and thereby desensitising the trauma. The consequences of their reticence, he said, has been to marginalise a central dimension of the Irish historical experience, and indeed, in some cases, virtually to write it out of the record. You could say that Bradshaw wasn't that far away from the post-colonialists and trauma theorists and so on. But Bradshaw says that revisionists were first of all reacting against nationalist historical orthodoxy of the early 20th century, and later against the recrudescence of radical militant nationalism in Northern Ireland. So they had the Troubles on their mind as they tried to pacify or cool down or ameliorate the historical record. Where a revisionist like FSL Lyons speaks of, quote, the picture of normality functioning bravely amid abnormality that is ignored in the media, and Lyons blames the journalism of catastrophe, where Bradshaw would have been blaming the journalism of anti-catastrophe, if you like. The journalism of catastrophe, with its hypnotic power, others consider catastrophe to require neither a journalistic response, one tied to the prevailing winds of the day, nor a scholarly suppression, equally anchored in public opinion. There's actually a little essay by Toni Morrison called Rootedness, the Ancestor as Foundation, which I think could quite readily be read alongside Brendan Bradshaw's notion of history. 40 Shades of Grey would be one way of describing the nothing to see here normalisation of School of Irish Studies, and no wonder what with a history so bloody and anaemic criticism would take hold. 40 shades of something, and each new Irish history graduate was handed a pot of whitewash and a brush. I begin where I began, where my own work in Ireland started 25 years ago, with Edmund Spencer's, people saying he was 10. 25 years ago, with Edmund Spencer's notorious account of the famine in Munster in the early 1580s that followed in the wake, or was part of, the so-called Munster Rebellion, Desmond Rebellion, of 1579 to 83. But before I get to Spencer and his view of the state of Ireland, written in 1596 and published in 1633, I'd like to cite 2 other contemporary sources, because there's a nice phrase I like from Ken Saro-Wiwa, the Nigerian writer, before, because it was always a before. And sometimes you have to get behind that other history that's been ignored by people who are interested in the big event. Because before the Munster famine, we can find in Thomas Churchyard, a minor Elizabethan writer but quite a significant writer, a text in which he justified 1579 a general rehearsal of wars. Thomas Churchyard justified the use of famine as a political weapon when he said Sir Humphrey Gilbert had authority of martial law generally committed unto him, as well for the execution of any within the limits of his commission, as for the annoyance of any offender by fire and sword, or any other kind of death, according to the quality of his or their offences, as otherwise at his discretion. And the gaining of time was one of his chiefest cares, both because he had no provision of victuals for his people, but pulled it, as it were, out of the enemy's mouth perforce. He further took this order infringible, that whensoever he made any hosting or inroad into the enemy's country, he killed man, woman and child, and spoiled, wasted and burned by the ground all that he might, leaving nothing of the enemies in safety which he could possibly waste or consume. And these were his reasons that persuaded him thereto, as I have often heard him say. First, the men of war could not be maintained without their churls and caliacs, or women who milked their creatures and provided their victuals and other necessaries, so that the killing of them by the sword was the way to kill the men of war by famine, who by flight oftentimes saved themselves from the dint of the sword. Also he held it dishonourable for the prince to practice with rebels, that is, to treat or accept or conclude peace treaties with them, to accept Her Majesty's mercy, and therefore he did always seem to care least for the submission of them whom he chiefly desired to have become true. Around the same period, the Irish section of Holinshed's Chronicles records the actions of Sir William Pelham, English Lord Justice, 1579, in his efforts to quell the so-called, again, Desmond Rebellion, or Munster land grab, as it actually was, because basically there was 500,000 acres, more than 500,000 acres, up for grabs. Holinshed says, and as they went, they drove the whole country before them unto the Bantry, I think that is, and by that means they prayed and took all the cattle in the country to the number of 8,000 kine, besides horses, garrons, sheep and goats, and all such people as they met, they did without mercy put to the sword. By these means the whole country, having no cattle nor kine left, they were driven to such extremities that for want of victuals they were either to die and perish for famine or to die under the sword. Famine was an English as well as an Irish experience in the period. There's some interesting writing being done on Henry VI Part 2, the Shakespeare play, and Jack Cade, who may or may not have been Irish. He's called a Kentishman, but there's various Irish connections, and there's aspects of famine in that. But there's no doubt that what Spenser witnessed of hunger went into the writing of the Faerie Queene, and in the Faerie Queene Spenser imagines hunger in a variety of ways, spiritual and actual, including the moment when Una is reunited with a gaunt Red Cross knight in Book 1, the Faerie Queene published in 1590. The account of the victims of the Munster famine is the most visited passage in Spenser's review. This was a catastrophic event that emptied out a populous area of Ireland, killing, in one estimate, 30,000 natives, which is one for every line of the Faerie Queene. Was it worth it? To make way for 3,000 settlers, including Spenser, a lot of collateral damage for a little cultural gain. Spenser's notorious description of the starving Irish may be the View's most frequently cited passage, but critics remain divided as to whether the speaker, Irenaeus, is lamenting a human disaster, advocating ethnic cleansing, or merely worried about how such a tragic spectacle will affect the Queen's continuing commitment to conquest. As with every textual crux, context is crucial. Eudoxus has just asked Irenaeus how his proposed strategy of quelling the natives will end. Irenaeus answers by adverting to the late wars in Munster. Basically, they put them on a diet. The end will, I assure me, be very, very short, and much sooner than can be in so great a trouble, as it seemeth hoped for. Although there should none of them fall by the sword, nor be slain by the soldier, they just thus being kept from manurance, and their cattle from running abroad, by this hard restraint they would quickly consume themselves, and devour one another. The proof whereof, he's explaining that famine will work, because if it worked in as rich a country as Munster was, if you manage to starve the people there, we can starve them anywhere. The proof whereof I saw sufficiently exampled in these late wars of Munster, for notwithstanding that the same was a most rich and plentiful country, full of corn and cattle, that you would have thought they should have been able to stand long, yet ere 1 year and a half they were brought to such wretchedness as that any stony heart would have rued the same. Out of every corner of the woods and glens they came creeping forth upon their hands, for their legs should not bear them. They looked like anatomies of death, they spake like ghosts crying out of their graves. They did eat the dead carrions, happy where they could find them, yea, and one another soon after, insomuch as the very carcasses they spared not to scrape out of their graves. And if they found a plot of watercresses or shamrocks, there they flocked as to a feast for the time, yet not able to continue therewithal, that in short space there were none almost left, and the most populous and plentiful country suddenly left void of man and beast. Yet sure in all that war there perished not many by the sword, but all by the extremity of famine, which they themselves had wrought. That is, by defying the Queen, they brought this famine upon themselves because it had been forced off their land and their castle had been destroyed. The narrative seems torn between the suffering arising from starvation and morbid fascination with survivors resorting to cannibalism, and this is called starvation cannibalism. In the course of the account, agency and responsibility, or survivalist cannibalism, in the course of the account, agency and responsibility shift from the English to the Irish. The Irish were kept from manurance, and by this hard restraint they would quickly consume themselves and devour one another. And despite having a rich and plentiful country, it was only 18 months before they were brought to eating one another. But by the end, Irenaeus can claim that the Irish themselves have sown the seeds of their own destruction. Any compassion is cancelled out by this closing assertion. They wrote it, so they bought it. This episode has to be read in its entirety, and not simply from the part beginning, any stony heart would have rued the same. The crucial reading is that of Eudoxus, who judges Irenaeus to be one of those authors and counsellors of such bloody platforms, to whom Elizabeth, full of that hypothetical pity he had simulated at such an awful eventuality, would have given little thanks. Now, a couple of years after this was written, Spencer, holed up in Cork City and under siege, wrote a document where he puts himself and the other settlers who have been burned out of their properties in the position of those kind of spectral figures. Spencer's View was published in Dublin in 1633, so though it's 1596 written, it's published in 1633, and let me trip forward to 1728, it's but a small jump. 1728, Jonathan Swift completed a short view of the state of Ireland. 1728, short view of the state of Ireland, a treatise whose title echoes closely that of Spencer's prose dialogue. Swift also echoes Spencer's description of lack and hunger in a land of plenty. There are people living starved lives in a land of plenty. Spencer's view of the state of Ireland opens with, if that land of Ireland is so commodious a soil, as you say, then why has more care not been taken for the reformation thereof, and so on. So this rich country with these people who are in miserable dress and diet, the general desolation in most parts of the kingdom, the old seats of the nobility and gentry all in ruins and no new ones in their stead, the families of farmers who pay great rents, living in filth and nastiness upon buttermilk and potatoes, without a shoe or stocking to their feet, or a house so convenient as an English hogsty to receive them. These indeed may be comfortable sights to an English spectator who comes for a short time only to learn the language and return back to his country, whether he finds all our wealth transmitted. And that's an important point, because that's, I think, one of the most important documents in English literature is Swift's Modest Proposal. But there he's saying there's starvation in a land of plenty and the wealth has been transmitted from there. In a Modest Proposal published the year after that, short view of Ireland, with its title, "For preventing the children of poor people in Ireland from being a burden to their parents or country and for making them beneficial to the public," Swift argues by implication in a Modest Proposal that the real cannibals are the English. In other words, for all but the best satire is the dreadful has already happened. This has actually happened. The real cannibals are the English, and that when in advocating that Irish children be cooked and seasoned for English tables, Swift is turning the tables on the English insofar as he is merely proposing a more extreme version of a state of affairs that already exists. England as a consuming culture. This is a crucial point because for satire to be successful there has to be a strong element of truth, a measure of accuracy. Swift suggests children are already being sacrificed on the altar of poverty, more to avoid the expense than the shame. This is a story where he says, despite Ireland being a Catholic country, there are women aborting in ditches because they can't afford to feed the children that they're having. So that's why want and need and starvation and so on are the primary experiences. More to avoid the expense than the shame. In other words, poor Irish women can't afford to have children, and it's not shame that's driving them to abort poverty. Having established that children are already dying, Swift next establishes that they are already being sold into slavery, as they were at this time. The dreadful has already happened. The rich are eating the children of the poor, and Swift's satire is not a proposal at all, however modest, but an exposure of the way things actually are. The children's flesh is dear, but the landlords can afford it, and after all, since they have already devoured the parents, why not finish the job? The proposer then confides that he has been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance, I don't think this is on the handout, in London, that a young healthy child well nursed is at a year old a most delicate, nourishing and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked or boiled. And I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or a ragout. Swift reminds his readers that since Catholic children outnumber Protestant infants, his modest proposal will also reduce the number of Catholics, something that would appeal to Ireland's English rulers. Swift suggests that in the waste not, want not climate of England, those who are more thrifty, as I must confess the times require, may flee the carcass, the skin of which artificially dressed will make admirable gloves for ladies and summer boots for fine gentlemen. Again, the suggestion is outrageous, but the implication is that amid a climate of poverty and want, admirable gloves for ladies and summer boots for fine gentlemen are important considerations. Swift next raises the question of adolescents who cannot get work and who may serve as a substitute for the deer that have been greedily devoured by the landowners. What about the elderly and infirm, I hear you ask? There's no place for them in the Modest Proposal, but they're done for anyway, because it is very well known, Swift tells us, that they are every day dying and rotting by cold and famine and filth and vermin as fast as can reasonably be expected. So that's us reassured. Swift concludes by listing the other advantages that will accrue, including the addition of 1,000 carcasses in an exportation of barrelled beef, the propagation of swine's flesh, and improvement in the art of making good bacon, so much wanted among us by the great destruction of pigs, too frequent at our tables, which are no way comparable in taste or magnificence to a well-grown, fat, yearling child, which roasted whole will make a considerable figure at a Lord Mayor's feast or any other public entertainment. Swift then rehearses other expedients, that is, alternatives to his modest proposal, things that could be done instead of eating the children of the poor. And ostensibly in order to rule them out, but as with Gulliver's Travels, in fact, in order to show what are the proper steps that ought to be taken to alleviate poverty in Ireland, taxing the absentees at 5 shillings a pound, using neither clothes nor household furniture except what is of our own growth and manufacture, utterly rejecting the materials and instruments that promote foreign luxury, curing the expensiveness of pride, vanity, idleness and gaming in our women, introducing a vein of parsimony, prudence and temperance, learning to love our country, and so on, in the want of which we differ even from Laplanders and inhabitants of Topinambu, and so on and so forth. The merchants, landowners, gentlemen and ladies, these are the real villains of the piece, the consumers of Irish flesh, at least metaphorically. Swift is merely asking them to have the honesty to take the next step and do it literally. Swift ends ironically by revealing, through a too strenuous denial, that like all proposers, he has a vested interest in this modest one. Having no children himself of edible age, he says, he can't hope to profit. Of course, it means nobody will be eating his kids. A modest proposal is not an argument in favour of eating the poor, but an attack on the greed and avarice of the rich. It takes the trope of cannibalism, a practice attributed to the so-called primitive or savage Irish, and throws it back in the faces of the English, who are held to be the real consumers of children. Some critics argue that since the rich continue to eat the poor, Swift's modest proposal remains relevant. The problem is that we now lack the satirical response. Is satire dead? Fast forward a little bit to 1752. The Anglo-Irish materialist philosopher, I love these philosophers, they're so serious and important, but this one, George Berkeley, in a pamphlet entitled A Word to the Wise, published in 1752, remarked, "The Negroes in our plantations have a saying, if Negro was not Negro, Irishman would be Negro. And it may be affirmed with truth that the very savages of America are better clad and better lodged than the Irish cottagers throughout the fine fertile counties of Limerick and Tipperary." Again, the fine fertile counties, but that's where people are starving and impoverished. Materialist philosophy brings us to Engels. In a letter to Marx dated 23rd of May 1856, Engels described the famine-stricken landscape of the west of Ireland. Throughout the west, but particularly the Galway region, the countryside is strewn with these derelict farmhouses, most of which have only been abandoned since 1846. I never imagined that famine could be so tangibly real. Whole villages are deserted. In between the splendid parts of the smaller landlords, virtually the only people still living there, lawyers mostly. Famine, emigration and clearances between them have brought this about. Okay, that's the missing page that you said. And okay, moving forward a little bit, in Yeats's The Countess Kathleen, we encounter charity and theft as means of survival. Kathleen says, "So you're starving even in this wood, where I thought I would find nothing changed. But that's a dream, for the old worm of the world can eat its way into what places it pleases." She gives money. Teague says, "Beautiful lady, give me something too. I fell but now, being weak with hunger and thirst, and lay upon the threshold like a log. I gave for all, and that was all I had. Look, my purse is empty. I have passed by starving men and women all this day, and they have had the rest. But take the purse. The silver clasps on it may be worth a trifle. But you'll come tomorrow to my house. You shall have twice the sum." Kathleen then says, "I thought to have escaped misfortune here. Has anyone been killed?" "Oh no, not killed. They have stolen half a cartload of green cabbage. But maybe they were starving. That is certain. To rob or starve, that was the choice they had. A learned theologian has laid down that starving men may take what's necessary and yet be sinless." The Countess Kathleen was written for Maud Gonne, and in 1900 Maud Gonne made an intervention on the famine, around the famine. The New York Times of April the 7th, 1900 contained a short notice headed "Dublin Paper Suppressed." Article signed by Maud Gonne and the Famine Queen, The Cause, London, April the 6th. "The Dublin police, by order of the government, seized today's issue of the United Irishman as a print, quote, calculated to produce discontent, disaffection and disloyalty. The immediate cause of the seizure was an article entitled The Famine Queen, signed by Maud Gonne." Now the Famine Queen was certainly calculated to produce disloyalty. Maudgon wrote, and in truth, for Victoria, in the decrepitude of her 81 years, to have decided after an absence of half a century to revisit the country she hates and whose inhabitants are the victims of the criminal policy of her reign, the survivors of 60 years of organised famine. I'll come to the notion of systematic famine, organised famine, deliberate policies of starvation, which we've seen is not a new thing. Tried in the 16th century, tried in the 21st century, in fact, tried many times. The political necessity must have been terribly strong, for after all she is a woman, and however vile and selfish and pitiless her soul may be, she must sometimes tremble as death approaches when she thinks of the countless Irish mothers who, sheltering under the cloudy Irish sky, watching their starving little ones, have cursed her before they died. Now, the line on organised famine is picked up in George Bernard Shaw's Man and Superman, published in 1903 but first performed in its entirety in Edinburgh in 1915, where the wealthy Irish American Hector Malone says, "Me father died of starvation in Ireland in the Black 47. Maybe you've heard of it. The famine? No, the starvation. When a country is full of food and exporting it, there can be no famine. Me father was starved dead, and I was starved out to America in my mother's arms. English rule drove me and mine out of Ireland. Well, you can keep Ireland. Me and me like are coming back to buy England, and we'll buy the best of it." Around the same time, in Yeats's The King's Threshold, 1904, the King explains the protest of the Shanahan. Is that right? Is that right? Shanahan, is it right to say? Yeah. Right. "He has chosen death, refusing to eat or drink that he may bring disgrace upon me. For there is a custom, an old and foolish custom, that if a man be wronged or think that he is wronged and starve upon another's threshold till he die, the common people for all time to come will raise a heavy cry against that threshold, even though it be the king's. The Shanahan asks his oldest pupil, 'There's nothing that can tether the wild mind, that being moonstruck and fantastical goes where it fancies. I had even thought I knew your voice and face, but now the words are so unlikely that I needs must ask, who is it that bids me put my hunger by?'" See, there are different lines on famine in the period, which is, it disappeared from literature, it wasn't represented in literature. Even Joyce, some people have said, that the famine isn't spoken about, isn't represented. The other line is, as I say, that one of my epigraphs, that the Celtic twilight and all the literature of the period is literally the gas coming out of the decomposing corpses. That's the Celtic twilight. In James Joyce's Ulysses, though, the connection between these different kinds of fasting, protest, political, religious and so on, the aesthetics of hunger. In James Joyce's Ulysses, 1922, the citizen speaks of the lasting legacy of famine. This is the Cyclops section. "We'll put force against force, says a citizen. We have our greater Ireland beyond the sea. They were driven out of house and home in the Black 47. Their mud cabins and their shillings by the roadside were laid low by the battering ram. And the Times rubbed its hand and told the white-livered Saxons there would soon be as few Irish in Ireland as Redskins in America. Even the Grand Turk sent us his piastres. But the Sassenach tried to starve the nation at home while the land was full of crops that the British hyenas bought and sold in Rio de Janeiro. Aye, they drove out the peasants in hordes. 20,000 of them died in the coffin ships. But those that came to the land of the free remember the land of bondage. And they will come again with a vengeance, no cravens, the sons of Grania, the champions of Catherine the Hooligan." Perfectly true, says Bloom. But my point was, perfectly true, says Bloom. But is it perfectly true? In 1942, Patrick Kavanagh's The Great Hunger presented Patrick Maguire, sex-starved, spiritually famished, Monaghan small farmer and potato gatherer. We may come out in the October reality, that's just a little snippet from the poem, imagination. The sleety wind no longer slants to the black hill where Maguire and his men are now collecting the scattered harness and baskets. The dog sitting on a wisp of dry stalks watches them through the shadows. Back in, one talks to the horse as to a brother. Maguire himself is patting a potato pit against the weather, an old man fondling a new piled grave. "Joe, I hope you don't forget to hide the spade, for there's rogues in the townland. Hide it flat in a furrow. I think we ought to be finished by tomorrow." Their voices through the darkness sound like voices from a cave, a dull thudding far away, futile, feeble, far away, first cousins to the ghosts of the townland. Now, I started with Spenser, and echoes of Spenser and Yeats travel forward and travel through into later literature. I'm going to have a couple of examples of them. How are people feeling at this early stage? You're not too warm, and you're coping with the voice okay, and you've got the hand out. In Bogoak from Wintering Out, 1972, Seamus Heaney evokes the nightmarish image of victims of the Munster famine as described in Spencer's view as a counterpoint to the poet's otherwise dreamy reflection. Perhaps I just make out Edmund Spencer, dreaming sunlight, encroached upon by geniuses who creep out of every corner of the woods and glens towards watercress and carrion. Of course, part of the story is there's no document of culture which is not a record of barbarism. Spencer was able to write the Faerie Queene on that estate in Ireland only because it had been cleared and literally people scraped out the graves. This might seem like from this, I don't know, from one thing to another, but I'm just going chronologically from 1579 to as near as I can get to the present. And I'm going to go to 1981. 1981, I remember summer 1981, being in Buncrana and Donegal when there was 6 coffins burning in the square. But I remember reading something in the Republican news which stuck in my head, which was a speech by Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro said something along these lines. He said, "Tremble, tyrants, at men who can take 60 days and more to die for their beliefs. What are the sufferings of Christ? What are his 3 days on the cross compared to the sacrifice of these men?" Now, that speech, those words, they were memorable words to me, but there's they appear now, a Cuban television station, Havana TV has got them up with a slightly different translation. Tyrants tremble when they are faced with men who are willing to die for their ideas after 60 days in a hunger strike, following the example of Christ's 3 days on Calvary, which for centuries has been a symbol of human sacrifice. It is time to put an end to this disgusting atrocity through the denunciations and pressure by the world community, and so on. So that's 1981. Pull us now into 1986, coming forward into the present. In 1986, Roy Foster, in an essay entitled "We Are All Revisionists Now," wrote as follows. He said, "A desire to expiate what are seen as past sins and a genuine surprise at the appalling record of much of British government in Ireland is understandable. It is probably good for the English soul, but it must be questioned whether it gets us any nearer understanding. Innocent and sometimes naively hilarious works of piety about the Fenians or Young Irelanders, written by amateur historians on the British left, fall into a much cruder category. They are joined by the half-baked sociologists employed on profitably never-ending research into anti-Irish racism." If anybody knows of these profitable research outlets, let me know. "Determined to prove what they have already decided to be the case, historians like Sheridan Gilly," who I had to look up and read one essay and I disagreed with every line of it, but anyway, historians like Sheridan Gilly may have scrupulously and sympathetically explored the definitions of historical racism and rejected them for the Irish case. Well, I'm sorry, Sheridan, have you seen the Equal Opportunities Commission lately? Have you read it? I'm sorry, it's too late. You can't turn that tide. They may have, and rejected them for the Irish case, but this matters to such zealots as little as the fact that, quote, "the great starvation as a synonym for the famine is a concept long exploded by economic historians." Now, I'm going to tell you something which I believe. I believe history is an open book and that everything's up for debate. And that's the opposite from saying it's a closed book and everything's been settled and shut up and go away, which I think isn't very good because I think it breeds all kinds of monsters. The following year, 1987, maybe this is one of the books that Roy Foster would have taken umbrage at. David Beresford's book, 10 Men Dead, appeared. And it concludes as follows. "A moment evocative of that unique blend of history, tragedy and theatre which is characteristic of the Anglo-Irish saga came in 1986, when Bick McFarlane appeared before a Dutch court to face a British application for his extradition back to Ireland. During the hearing, a stooped and wrinkled old man took the witness stand to tell the foreign judges something of the story of the Anglo-Irish conflict. He was Sean McBride, winner of both the Nobel and Lenin Peace Prizes, former Irish Cabinet Minister and one-time Chief of Staff of the IRA. McBride was the son of John McBride, executed in the 1916 Rising, and of the most famous of Irish beauties, Maud Gonne. Maud was the great love in the life of W.B. Yeats, whose inner turmoil over the 1916 executions, his jealousy of John McBride, coupled with his admiration for their sacrifices, produced the famous poem Easter 1916, and the line so redolent of that episode, "A Terrible Beauty is Born." Subsequently, following the death of Terence McSweeney, Yeats rewrote the ending of his hunger strike play, The King's Threshold. It originally had the poet Shanahan abandoning the fast and living on. In the rewritten version, Shanahan dies, surrounded by his young apprentices who are themselves under sentence of death, and the poet's dying words are as fitting an epitaph as any for the great Irish hunger strike of the summer of 1981. When I and these are dead, we should be carried to some windy hill, to lie there with uncovered face a while, that mankind and that leper there may know, dead faces laugh, king, king, dead faces laugh. Now that harping back can be seen too in a poem dating from 1990, Ivan Boland's That the Science of Cartography is Limited. That the science of cartography is limited, and not simply by the fact that this shading of forest cannot show the fragrance of balsam, the gloom of cypresses, is what I wish to prove. When you and I were first in love, we drove to the borders of Connaught and entered a wood there. Look down, you said. This was once a famine road. I looked down at ivy and the scotch grass rough cast stone had disappeared into, as you told me, in the second winter of their ordeal in 1847, when the crop had failed twice. Relief committees gave the starving Irish such roads to build. When they died, there the road ended, and ends still. And when I take down the map of this island, it is never so I can say, here is the masterful, the apt rendering of the spherical as flat, nor an ingenious design which persuades a curve into a plane, but to tell myself again that the line which says woodland and cried hunger and gives out among sweet pine and cypress and finds no horizon will not be there. In other words, even the map, that apparently neutral thing that we take down, but then nothing's neutral and no geographical expression is neutral, but even the map that we take down won't show certain things. It won't show those, or might not show, or might not explain those roads to nowhere that were built by the starving. In the year but that's why I say long since exploded. Sadly, nothing's exploded but incendiary devices. In the year that Boland's poem was written, a short verse by Richard Ryan, then Irish ambassador to the Republic of Korea, entitled Father of Famine, was anthologised in Irish Penguin Contemporary Irish Poetry. Father of Famine by Richard Ryan. Shadow boxer, fighting man, old locust eater, bruised waxwing of the nest of dust, O feeder of honey to the dead, mon père, I would be led. Must I neglect food to no hunger? Must I neglect food to no hunger? And there are those types of hunger, the hunger of the soul, there might be the hunger for freedom, and so on, spiritual starvation, sexual starvation. So I went looking for something there. I went looking for the field. I remember seeing the field with Richard Harris, and I remember Richard Harris's speech to the priest, where he says something which is debatable, which is, no priest starved during the famine, or no priest starved in the Great Hunger. While we lay in the ditches, with the grass juice running from our mouths, the priests had a full table and so on. So I remember that. I thought I'll go and look for it, but of course I didn't get the screenplay, I got the stage play. But I found another little piece on hunger from the stage play, which made me think that the screenplay must have picked up on that. I think sometimes there's more drama in cinema, or someone else has come along and added that other layer to it. I think that's the answering cry of what I'm going to read, which is the bishop in the bishop's speech. This is a parish in which you understand hunger, but there are many hungers. There is a hunger for food, a natural hunger. There is a hunger of the flesh, a natural and understandable hunger. There is a hunger for home, for love, for children. These things are good. They are good because they are necessary. But there is also the hunger for land, and in this parish you and your father before you knew what it was to starve because you did not own your own land, and that has increased this unappeasable hunger for land. But how far are you prepared to go to satisfy this hunger? Are you prepared to go to the point of robbery? Are you prepared to kill for land? Was this man killed for land? Did he give his life's blood for a field? If so, that field will be a field of blood, and it will be paid for in 30 pieces of silver, the price of Christ's betrayal, and you by your silence will share in that betrayal. In 1993, Maud Ellman's book, provocative, brilliant book, it's hard to get a hold of, this book, but it's worth getting hold of, appeared, The Hunger Artists, Starving, Writing and Imprisonment. And she talks about, in the Irish hunger strike of 1981, it was not by starving but by making a spectacle of their starvation that the prisoners brought shame on their oppressors and captured the sympathies of their co-religionists. Representation in all the senses of the word determined the outcome of the hunger strike, for it was only when Bobby Sands was elected as MP to represent the county of Fermanagh that the world's press swarmed into Belfast to represent the starving body to the nations. However, the feature that distinguishes a hunger strike from other forms of self-starvation is a statement that supplements the wordless testimony of the famished flesh. To hold the body up for ransom, to make mortality into a bargaining chip, hunger strikers must declare the reasons for their abstinence. I'm going to skim on a little bit to 1995. 1995, on the eve of the 150th anniversary of 1847. In Heathcliff and the Great Hunger, Terry Eagleton remarked upon the absence of the famine from modern literature. I say everything that I've said is arguable, and I think that's a good thing, as opposed to saying, well, we know that now, because such and such a person who lectures at St Andrews said. But this is Eagleton. During the famine, starving families boarded themselves into their cabins so that their death might go decently unviewed. After the event, there were villages which could still speak Irish but didn't. It was considered bad luck. And to touch on the language question is to consider a death of the signifier of a rather different order. The famine is apparently non-signifying then, not only because it figures ideologically speaking as a brute act of nature, but also because it threatens to burst through the bounds of representation as surely as Auschwitz did for Theodor Adorno. Though at least so some thought about the Holocaust, you could ascribe it to a subject of some kind, a transcendentally evil one, whereas a blankly indifferent nature is not even enough of a subject to be malevolent. Cormac O'Grady has remarked on the striking paucity of Irish historical writing on the famine, a project which has been largely delegated to non-Irish scholars, and this wary silence had already been noted by James Conley in Labour and Irish History. But a parallel repression or evasion would seem to be at work in Irish literary culture, which is hardly rife with allusions to the event. There is indeed a literature of the famine, which has been valuably explored and anthologised by Christopher Morash, but it is in neither sense of the word a major literature. There is a handful of novels and a body of poems, but few truly distinguished works. Where is the famine in the literature of the revival? Where is it in Joyce? Somebody might say it's in Joyce's The Dead, or it's in all of Joyce, it's in Finnegan's Wake, it's everywhere in Joyce. I gave one passage, and there's a book on Joyce and population control, which would say that Joyce was very preoccupied by famine. Eagleton does acknowledge some of this work. The same year that Eagleton's book appeared, Declan Kibaird's Inventing Ireland also appeared. Now, I'm always interested in indexes. Other people tell me to look at acknowledgements in books. I'm always interested in indexes and seeing what's been covered. Declan Kibaird's Inventing Ireland appeared with an index that had the same number of entries for famine as for Walt Whitman, and half as much entries as Shakespeare. In fact, there are more allusions to Fanon, very good, more allusion to Fanon than famine in Inventing Ireland. Of the famine, Kibaird's comments, disappointment gave way to desperation in the years of famine during the 1840s. Almost 1 million people died from starvation and associated disease, and in the same decade, 1.5 million emigrated. Irish-speaking areas were among the hardest hit, with the result that only a quarter of the population was recorded as speaking the language after 1851. I think Ireland is the only famine in history where the population never recovered. It's never recovered to the levels it was. Through the earlier years of hunger, the British held to their laissez-faire economic theories, and ships carried large quantities of grain from the starving island. Arguments raged, and still do, as to the degree of British culpability, but Irish public opinion was inflamed. While some landlords behaved with great callousness towards their ruined tenantry, others were heroic in generosity and in organising countermeasures. Schindler's List, presumably. But pervading all was a sense that this was the final betrayal by England. As so often, the balance of the debate was well registered, and the popular peasant saw, God sent the potato blight, but the English caused the famine. Later, Kibaird's observes that Ireland, after the famines of the mid-19th century, was a sort of nowhere, waiting for its appropriate images and symbols to be inscribed in it. Or again, for after the famines and emigration of the 1840s, Ireland had almost ceased to exist in the old Gaelic way. What was left, the remaining voices confirmed this, was a terrifyingly open space in places and persons. This same year of Eagleton and Kibairdh, again 1995, Professor Amartya Kumar Sen, the 1998 Nobel laureate in economics, Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, published a short essay in Granta magazine entitled Nobody Needs Starve, in which he did several things. He quoted the Bernard Shaw, he mentioned Spencer's Faerie Queene. I think he had in mind a view of the present state of Ireland more than the Faerie Queene, but he mentioned that, and he talked about the nature of famine. The question that arises is, why was Ireland with so little food exporting food to England, which had so much? And he goes on basically to talk about colonial attitudes. He said, the rulers never starve. It is not surprising that in the gruesome history of famines there is hardly any case in which a famine has occurred in a country that is independent and democratic, regardless of whether it is rich or poor. In India, famines continued to occur right up to independence. the last British Indian famine, the Bengal famine of 1943, and so on. This is when Churchill said, these people are breeding like rabbits, or whatever it was. So he goes on to talk about the Faerie Queene and all the fact that this is a very long history. But he also gives an example of Charles Edward Trevelyan, the head of the Treasury during the famines, who saw not much wrong with British policies in Ireland, of which he was a major architect. He took the opportunity to remark, "There is scarcely a woman of the peasant class in the west of Ireland whose culinary art exceeds the boiling of a potato." And Sen says, humorously, "This remark is interesting not just because it is rare for an Englishman to find a suitable opportunity for an international criticism of culinary art, but also because pointing the accusing finger at the Irish peasant diet vividly illustrates the inclination to fault some characteristic of in other words, blaming the victims." If a Nobel laureate, a prize-winning economist speaks, I listen, I pay attention. I might not agree, but I'll pay attention. I'll listen to what they have to say. And if they're telling me that all the myths about the famine haven't been exploded, might not even have been explored, then I'm interested, because I love reading and it's good to find things out and to have arguments. In 1997, in fact before that, I'm going to go on to 1996. In September 1996, just almost an aside, on September the 10th, 1996, the New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education had approved for inclusion in the Holocaust and Genocide curriculum at the secondary level a new curriculum on the Great Irish Famine. This curriculum is dedicated to the millions of Irish who suffered and perished in the Great Starvation. It is also dedicated to those who escaped by emigration and to the Great Irish diaspora worldwide. In 1997, Mutability, a play by Frank McGuinness based on an imagined encounter between Shakespeare and Spenser in Ireland, The Tempest meets a view of the present state of Ireland, was staged at the Royal National Theatre in London. The character of Edmund made a speech early on that was lifted straight from Spenser's view, and I've got that speech there. I think looking at the time I'll leave that speech, you've got it on the handout, but it reproduces that speech from the view. And also that notion of animality. I heard someone say in a context about Ireland describing people like cornered animals, and I thought, it's not, I can look in the 16th century and find the same imagery, the same metaphors and the same language applied to the Irish as I would find last week in my newspaper. So there is a sense of the nothing new under the sun, as Beckett said. So, up to 2001, Holocaust and genocide and literature and Nobel laureates are all good and well. But what about Roy Foster? What does he have to tell us? Reviewing Roy Foster's The Irish Story in 2001 in The Independent on the 27th of October 2001, I meant to say at the beginning, puns are dangerous, but they're everywhere. The Irish love them, and you can't get anything into James Joyce's 2 foot before you're 6 foot under with puns. Remember? Edward and Victoria and their civilization and so on. So there's plenty of puns doing the rounds, but here's a review of Roy Foster's book in The Independent, 27th October 2001. Near the start is a discussion of what Foster calls the boom in pop history. That's not history of pop music, it's popular history. Famine commemoration projects, for example, reached such a pitch in the 1990s that some wit dubbed the whole furore faminism. Foster is an exemplary critic, and the Irish story has rarely received so lively and unbiased an unfolding. Well, that's some wit, that is, to christen it feminism. Is this the same wit that came up with Holocaust effectiveness? Google it and see. It's hard to be both racist and sexist in one word, though it can be done. But telling people to shut up about starvation by tagging them with the loony feminist nonsense brush really takes a biscuit. I like a pun as much as I like a podium. It can add a layer of meaning to a text, but the aim of this pun is to starve, to belittle, not enlarge. In fact, if you look at the actual passage in Foster's book, it's worse than we thought. I've only cited Patricia Craig. Now this is Foster's actual piece. Talk about getting it both ways. Back in Ireland, says Foster, all this activity sourly referred to in some quarters as feminism, an appellation which the more humourless practitioners quickly appropriated for themselves. Okay. Produced a historical payoff. This took the form of some first-rate and important local research, a number of extremely worthwhile conferences, and a shift among historians towards a consensus of concentration upon the role of the British government, specifically the economic assumptions of the then Liberal Prime Minister Lord John Russell and his ministers and civil servants. But the overall effect, while it boosts popular interest in a kind of Irish history, may not really lead to much illumination. The same has to be said about the next great commemorative binge, the failed rising of 1798, which from late 1997 ruthlessly shoved the famine celebrants into the wings. Again, government ministers were detailed. Again, the decks were cleared for public events. Again, a political and marketing agenda was easily discerned and in fact articulated. The 1798 Commemoration Committee stressed that remembering this event will benefit the country tourist-wise, and so the rebellion was commodified and packaged with a heritage trail, tea towels, videos, reconstructions. The question has to be confronted, however, whether reconstruction in the 1990s has much to do with what can painfully be re-established about whatever the contemporary reality may have been. That's what 40 Shades of Whitewash looks like. You can see your face in it. The 150th anniversary of the Irish Famine, Great Hunger, Mass Starvation saw the publication of a great deal of history addressing a considerable catastrophe. 2 years ago, William Mulligan, writing a retrospective piece on Cecil Woodham Smith's The Great Hunger, or Monumental Great Hunger, spoke of the case for emotion in an echo of Brendan Bradshaw's appeal of 20 years earlier. As I see it, said Mulligan, the great strength of Woodham Smith's book, however, is not its research base, but precisely its emotional intensity. There are few shades of grey in Woodham Smith's view of the famine. Even the title makes a clear interpretative statement. There are villains, victims and people who merit praise for the relief efforts. They all are well developed, they emerge as real people, even the villains have some good qualities. They remain villains. The character and motivation of people involved at every level is analysed in detail. There are no easy labels attached to people or policies or strong men set up as easy targets to demolish. This makes Woodham Smith's argument harder to dismiss or discount. She has weighed the evidence and not jumped to conclusions. Last year, the Irish famine, I'm coming to my conclusion now, because last year, the Irish famine and hunger strikes, remember where I started with Spencer and Swift, the Irish famine and hunger strikes were back on the agenda. The radar, the stage, the front page, in the form of Steve McQueen and Enda Walsh's film, Hunger, and the famine song, sung by some supporters of Glasgow Rangers Football Club. The famine song. This was reported in the Times last September. Rangers have again been left with no option but to ask their supporters to stop singing an offensive song after fresh political pressure was brought to bear on the club yesterday. A section of Ibrox fans has recently taken to singing a particular chant about the Irish Catholic community in Scotland. The song was given fresh volume and expression at last month's Old Firm match at Celtic Park. Yesterday, Rangers admitted they have been working behind the scenes in conjunction with Strathclyde Police to try to have the song, unofficially known as the famine song, stamped out. The club even warned that supporters could be arrested if caught indulging in the chant. The song refers to the Irish famine of the 1840s, which killed an estimated 1 million people and triggered mass migration to Scotland, and includes the line, "The famine's over, why don't you go home?" In fact, the song is a song that people will know. The famine song, the lyrics are online, and there's a YouTube thing of it being sung by the Dirty Blighters. I've said before I like a pun as much as the next word player. Urges Celtic supporters to return to Ireland now that the famine is over, and it goes through there are various things that have to be explained. I believe that Lars John must be Big Jock Steen, and I believe that the wee traitor from Castlemilk must be Aidan McGiddy, who decided not to play for Scotland but to play for Ireland. But I'm only saying that in I only got this. It's fresh in my hands. I won't read it and I won't sing it. I've challenged Colin to do so at some point. But I'm going to come back to the famine song. Steve McQueen, speaking of the hunger strikes of 1981, says in an interview posted on the 23rd of October 2008, he recalled, "I was 11, and at that age, the idea that someone would voluntarily stop eating seemed very strange to me. Every evening, Bobby Sands' picture appeared on television along with the growing number of days since the start of his hunger strike. Emotions ran high that year, as it was also the time of the Brixton riots, and the whole world literally opened up during that period. I believe it's the most important event to have happened in the UK over the past 27 years, for this type of situation continues to occur all over the world today. But it was more the human situation than the political context that interested me. I wanted to explore that strong impression it gave me at the time and find out more. I thought it was a very powerful subject for a film. My decision to make a film about it didn't stem from wanting to find a wider audience than for my work in contemporary art, but because the subject required a complex narrative. So from the Faerie Queene to Steve McQueen, I started with Spencer. This is my conclusion. Now, I started with Spencer, where I said my work in Irish studies began. But that's not strictly true, because my own work in Ireland began with the aftermath of the Great Hunger that drove my grandfather, my Irish grandfather, and his brothers and sisters to leave Mayo, the 3 brothers to Glasgow, the 3 sisters to Ohio. I don't know the exact date in the late 1880s or early 1890s that my grandfather came from Castlebar to Glasgow to sleep in a doorway for 3 nights before he could get digs. But I came across a reference in Hansard recently that talks about famine and famine fever in Castlebar in 1880. And that's a long quotation that I won't read out, except it includes an interesting line by Parnell. I also corrected it. I corrected what was on site because I thought typo was a typo. I thought the word typo was a typo and must be tight. But now I'm thinking it must actually refer to typhoid. We think if we saw a typo now, we'd say it was typo. But now I'm thinking maybe I shouldn't have corrected that because typhoid was one of the list of things that came under the heading of famine fever. Typhoid, cholera. There was 6 or 7 things that came under famine fever. So that's famine fever. The famine song, that song sung by Rangers supporters urging the Irish in Scotland to go home. I should say that there's no counter song urging the descendants of the Ulster plantation to go home. The plantation's over, why don't you go home? There's none of that. The famine song, that song sung by Rangers supporters urging the Irish in Scotland to go home, is sung to the tune of, I thought when I heard it, I thought it was sung to the tune of the Beach Boys' Sloop John B, which is a wonderful song, actually an old folk song from the West Indies recorded by the Weavers and the Kingston Trio, among others. I think it's about a pirate ship and it's from about 1900, that song, Why Don't You Go Home? I Want to Go Home. The 1966 Beach Boys version goes, we come on the sloop John B, my grandfather and me, around Nassau town we did roam, drinking all night, going to a fight, well I feel so broke up, I want to go home. What goes around comes around, and this is my final piece. What goes around comes around. 6 years before the Beach Boys released Sloop John B, Lonnie Donegan had a top 10 UK hit with a version entitled I Want to Go Home. I Want to Go Home was the title. This was 1960, the year of my birth. No, surely not. 1970, it's a typo. The year of my birth. Lonnie Donegan was born Anthony James Donegan to a Scottish father with an Irish surname and an Irish mother, Mary Josephine Deegan, in Bridgeton, Glasgow, a part of the city with strong links to Glasgow Rangers. Bridgeton is called Brigton. There's a Brigton Dairy. It's a notorious, it's a place where there's been a Celtic supporter murdered in the last few years, but it's a notoriously orange and Rangers part of the city. Lonnie Donegan, as his name suggests, had many Irish connections. Chris Pendergast, the Gaelic footballer, is a relative, and in 2000 Donegan played on Van Morrison's album The Skiffle Sessions live in Belfast 1998. He was awarded the MBE in 2000. What would this Irish-Scottish Glaswegian from Bridgeton and member of the British Empire have made of the song that he charted with in 1960, being used as a stick to beat the Irish in Scotland? Donegan died in 2002, so it's too late to ask him. Thanks for your attention.